Once again, I think we got a bit of a sermon within the songs as Jerry was leading us in that package. I was just reminded of the way that Paul moves in Colossians. In the book of Colossians, Paul, he writes this. He begins with, so we have not stopped praying for you since we first heard about you. We ask God to give you complete knowledge of His will and to give you spiritual wisdom and understanding. Then the way you live will always honor and please the Lord, and your lives will produce every kind of good fruit. All the while you will grow as you learn to know God better and better. We also pray that you will be strengthened with all His glorious power so that you will have all the endurance and patience you need. That song, Yes, I Will Lift Your Name in the Lowest Valley, that is a song that is coming out of a space of endurance and patience because life is hard. But in the middle of that, Paul prays, may you be filled with joy, always thanking the Father. He's enabled you to share in the inheritance that belongs to His people who live in the light. For He's rescued us from the kingdom of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of His dear Son, who purchased our freedom and forgave our sins. And as we were singing about Jesus with What a Wonderful Name, I was just reminded of what Paul talks about next in Colossians 1. He just begins in Colossians 1 to worship Jesus. And he says, Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. He existed before anything was created, and He is supreme over all creation. For through Him, God created everything in the heavenly realms and on earth. He made the things we can see and the things we can't see, such as thrones, kingdoms, rulers, and authorities in the unseen world. Everything was created through Him and for Him. He existed before anything else, and He holds all creation together. Christ is also the head of the church, which is His body. He's the beginning, supreme over all who rise from the dead. So He is first in everything. For God in all His fullness was pleased to live in Christ, and through Him God reconciled everything to Himself. He made peace with everything in heaven and on earth by means of Christ's blood on the cross. And then Paul goes into the gospel. He says, this includes you who were once far away from God. You were His enemies, separated from Him by your evil thoughts and actions, yet now He has reconciled you to Himself through the death of Christ in His physical body. As a result, He has brought you into His own presence, and you are holy and blameless as you stand before Him without a single fault. That's the way God sees you. In God's presence through Jesus Christ, God sees you as holy and blameless, standing before Him without a single fault. But you must continue to believe this truth and stand firmly in it. Don't drift away from the assurance you received when you heard the good news. This good news has been preached all over the world, and I, Paul, have been appointed as God's servant to proclaim it. That's just a little bit of a bonus sermon before the main sermon. And just as we are kind of going through that worship package, that's what God brought to my mind. Just this reminder that as we lift Jesus high, and as we call ourselves to endure in the midst of the difficulty, we find that strength and we find that reminder that He is above all. We're going to get into our sermon, but before we do, I have one announcement to make. Last month, we had a picnic in the back field. It was lovely. It was a good chance to get together. And as I was realizing how quickly the summer was moving, and I hated to admit it, to realize that next Sunday is August 1, I got scared a little bit. Some of you have been camping. Have you noticed that we're starting to get those August nights? You know, it's kind of getting cool, like not quite single digit, but almost in places. It's kind of freaking me out a little bit that our summer it's different. I'm hoping that our summer will get back to some heat, get back to some hot nights. But I realized, man, the summer's slipping past. We have to do a picnic again. And so next Sunday, August 1, we are doing a bring your own picnic in the backfield here. The reason why we do these is because they are stunningly simple. There is no organization required. Everyone simply needs to bring their own picnic, and then we set up our lawn chairs in the backfield. We play games. We hang out. Some of you are thinking, hey, I don't even know how to get a picnic together. God has blessed us with Burger King. And so in like 5 minutes, you can get a picnic to bring. We have coupons here at the church. I mean, they have family meals for like $20.99. You can feed a family of 4 for $21. So I'm not preaching Burger King here. I'm just letting you know that next week, to bring your own picnic, it could be as simple as a quick drive-through, come back. So please bring your own picnic. Bring some lawn chairs. If the weather is terrible, we'll just move into the basement and we'll play our ping pong and pool down there instead. But if the weather's nice, we'd love to be set up out there. We're going to bring our shade tent. We're going to have some outdoor games. If you bring some outdoor games, it'll be a good chance to spend an hour or two hanging out. So next Sunday, bring your own picnic. We'll just enjoy a little bit of time together again. I'm hoping the summer will arrive again, and we will complain about how hot the weather is. Because in Alberta, we love to complain about our weather. All right, so that was the announcements. You've had Sermon A. You've had a fun in the announcement. Now we're getting into Sermon 2, the main one. And over the last 14 months, we've wandered in and out of the book of Acts in a series we've titled Following the Way. We've stopped it, we've started it, we've stopped it, we've started it, and then we started it again. So we've kind of been in and out of this. And as we've journeyed through the book of Acts, we've been looking at the experiences of the early church. We've been looking at the person and the work of the Holy Spirit because we've been wanting to find out what the Spirit wants to do in the church. We've also been looking at the church to discover what it might have been like for the early church to be followers of the way of Jesus. So each Sunday in this series, we've been trying to learn some lessons about what it might mean for us to be followers of the way of Jesus. And there have been times where, as we've dove into the story, we just don't necessarily know what's happening at first glance. And so we've had to take a better look. We've had to kind of stop and analyze and say, okay, what's happening here in these stories that some of us may have read but skipped past? So this Sunday, we arrive at Acts 16, verses 1 to 5. This is the beginning of Paul's second missionary journey. And this is also going to be our last Sunday in Acts for a while. Next week, we're going to begin a new series that will build up to the fall called Our Church. And so we're literally going to be looking at our church and our church family and some of the things that our church is about as we kind of build towards the fall. And so that's what's happening next Sunday. But for this Sunday, we are going to walk with Paul in the beginnings of his first missionary journey. And as we begin in Acts 16, what I want to do is I want to recap the story so that we're going to have a frame of reference in what's happening in Acts 16. I don't want to rewind too far, but I do want to rewind all the way back to Acts 13. And so in Acts 13, in verses 1 to 4, we found a group of leaders at the church in Syrian Antioch, and they were praying and they were worshiping. And while they were praying, the Spirit called out Paul and Barnabas to go on mission. Can you imagine a gathering like this if all of a sudden, as we were praying, the Spirit said, okay, there's two of you that I've appointed to go on mission. And so then with more praying and fasting, we sent this group of people out. That's basically what happened in Acts 13, 1 to 4. Paul and Barnabas were appointed by the Spirit to go on mission. The other church leaders, they prayed, they fasted, they affirmed this call, and Paul and Barnabas went out. They left from Syrian Antioch. They traveled to the island of Cyprus, Barnabas' homeland. There they preached to the entire island of Cyprus. Then they traveled north to Turkey, and they preached in Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. Many people hear the good news about Jesus. They come to believe. There's also some persecution that happens. In Cyprus, the message of Jesus is opposed by a sorcerer named Elymas, and a spiritual battle ensues in which Elymas is struck blind by the power of God, and a Roman governor who watches all this go down comes to believe in Jesus. It's a super cool story. We talked about that a number of weeks ago. In Lystra, after healing a crippled man, Paul and Barnabas are mistaken for Greek gods, and the townspeople try to offer a sacrifice to worship them. When Paul and Barnabas realize what's happening, they rush to try to restrain this group, but then the crowd turns on them when some other people arrive in the middle of the chaos. They start to throw rocks at Paul. They strike him again and again until he's as good as dead, and they drag his body out of town, thinking that he's going to be left there for dead. The wolves are going to pick apart his body. That's going to be the end of Paul. But Paul basically gets up off the ground, brushes off the blood and the dirt, goes back into that community, preaches to those guys again, and then leaves to go on to a new community. It's a wild story. And then they keep on going for a year and a half on mission. And then Paul and Barnabas return to Antioch. And when they arrive back at their home church, they've established churches throughout Cyprus and south central Turkey. They've appointed leaders, and these churches are continuing the work of reaching into their communities with a life-changing message of Jesus. And so that was Paul and Barnabas' first missionary journey. And then back in Syrian Antioch, Paul and Barnabas, they continue to teach and preach. They're sharing the good news, but they're also sharing the good news that God is up to something different. So the early church from Acts 2 to 12 is largely composed of Jewish believers. In Acts 8, the Samaritans hear and believe the good news, but for the most part, these early followers of the way of Jesus are either Jewish people or Samaritans or non-Jewish people that have already come to believe in the God of Israel, and they're already practicing the Jewish faith. But in time, what happens as the message of Jesus goes, it begins to cross ethnic and religious and cultural barriers. And Paul and Barnabas see a massive move of Gentiles, that is non-Jewish people, come to Jesus. And so suddenly, there's this group that has largely been considered kind of a subset of Judaism. Suddenly, it's beginning to include all kinds of different people from all kinds of different religious and ethnic backgrounds. And because we are not part of this first century world, it takes a little bit for us to get in mind, because in the grandest scheme of things, very few of us in this room would identify as ethnically Jewish. I think for the most part, we would all say, well, we are Germanic, or we're British, or we were, what other kind of cultural backgrounds do we got here? Polish. We got some Polish people here. What else do we got? Irish. We got some Irish people. Scottish German. 29% Jewish. Oh, all right. So we have one person here that would identify as slightly over a quarter Jewish, right? And so what happened is the message of Jesus began to cross into these other cultural and ethnic regions in the Roman Empire. Part of the reason why we see that problem in Acts 14, where these guys think that Paul and Barnabas are Greek gods, is because Paul and Barnabas are beginning to actually go to non-Jewish people, and they're beginning to talk about Jesus, and those people are coming at it with their own cultural worldview. They're coming with their own stories, and they say, okay, a God who became man, that kind of sounds like Hercules. And so they think, hey, Hercules. And they're like, no, we're talking about a better guy. We're talking about a God who became man, but who's still God. His name is Jesus, and he's come to save you from your sins. And they just have no category for that at first. But as this good news begins to spread, there becomes a lot of people that are hungry for Jesus. They recognize that Jesus is the answer to the problem that they've been facing. And this is exciting, but this also creates some difficulty in the church, because in Acts 15, we see a group of Jewish believers come up from Jerusalem preaching the message that in order for non-Jewish people, all the rest of us, in order for us to come to Jesus, this group is saying we have to convert to Judaism first. Men must be circumcised according to the law of Moses. All of us must keep the Jewish law, including the Jewish dietary law. Some of our people at the back, our tech team, they had Egg McMuffins this morning. Do you know what a key ingredient in an Egg McMuffin is? It's bacon, or it's the back bacon. Those would not be allowed in our church. That would have been a bad scene. And so that's what's kind of happening. They're preaching up here and saying, hey, if you had an Egg McMuffin this morning, you're guilty of a great sin. You got to get rid of that stuff. And so this was causing conflict and confusion. Again, in this group, I think most of us are identifying as Gentiles to some degree. We're not Jewish. We're certainly, if we are of Jewish ethnicity, we're certainly not practicing the Judaic law. And so can you imagine if after coming to Jesus and after being accepted by him, he's forgiven our sins, can you imagine if I now came and said, oh, by the way, you're not actually saved until first, men, you submit to circumcision, and then for the rest of you, you go home, you get rid of all your bacon, you get rid of all your non-kosher products. We need to travel 3 times a year to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices. So yeah, by the way, travel cost is involved. And you need to keep all the right holidays and all the right holy days. And you got to do that before Jesus will love and accept you. Can you imagine if that's the message? You sort of were starting to walk with Jesus, and then all of a sudden the whole thing flipped on you. There was a lot of confusion. The people didn't understand what was happening. And so Paul and Barnabas, they began to argue with this group. They opposed this group. And so now there's kind of 2 voices in the church in Antioch. You got to become Jewish to be saved. You don't have to become Jewish to be saved. The church decided to send a delegation to Jerusalem to find out the answer. What is God's plan for all people? And so they traveled down to Jerusalem, and through a season of discernment and listening, they recognized that God's plan all along was to bring both Jewish people and non-Jewish people together into one new family, and God would save these people the same way, not through works, but through faith in Jesus. And so the church leaders then issued a statement asking the Gentile believers to refrain from 4 overtly occultic practices in order to experience greater unity with the Jewish believers, and implicitly these Jewish believers were asked to love and accept their new brothers and sisters in Christ. And so all that happened in Acts 15. There was this cultural battle at work. There was questions about how people are saved. If you want to hear more about the council and those events, you can listen to the sermon from 2 weeks ago. And so then what happened was at the end of that section, the church, they reported back into Antioch that, hey, all of us people who are non-Jewish, we can be saved through faith in Jesus Christ. We don't have to become Jewish first. We can just begin to follow Jesus. They've asked us to not do some things that would make it hard for Jewish people and us to sort of have fellowship together. But we can be a family. We can love one another all through Jesus. And so that was reported back to the church in Antioch. There was great rejoicing. There was great excitement. God is on the move. Gentile believers could be included in the church alongside Jewish believers. And there was this growing understanding now in the church that God was on a move in the world to save people from all over the world. And so this is kind of the first half of Acts 15. After some more time passes, Paul and Barnabas decide to go back and visit the churches that they planted on their first journey. But there was a disagreement over the inclusion of one of the workers, a guy named John Mark. John Mark had started on the first missionary journey, but he'd abandoned them. And the fight over whether John Mark should be included, shouldn't be included, caused Paul and Barnabas to separate. And while they did disagree and separate, they were united in mission, they were united in purpose. Barnabas and John Mark went to Cyprus to visit and strengthen the churches there. Paul and a guy named Silas went overland through Tarsus, back to the regions in Turkey. And there Paul visited the churches that he'd previously started in Lystra, Derbe, and Iconium. If you want to hear more about that sermon, you can listen to the one from last week. But I need to kind of get you caught up in the story, because the book of Acts is a story. And so now that you're kind of knowing, okay, I kind of think I know what's going on, Acts 16, 1-5 is where we're going to dive into today. And please try to keep in mind, Paul and Silas are visiting a region that Paul had previously visited. He'd planted churches. And in Acts 15, there's this whole discussion about how people are saved as Gentiles. This is really, really important to Acts 16, 1-5. So reading Acts 16, 1-5, it says this. Paul went first to Derbe and then to Lystra, so again to those regions where he visited first, where there was a young disciple named Timothy. His mother was a Jewish believer, but his father was a Greek. Timothy was well thought of by the believers in Lystra and Iconium, so Paul wanted him to join them on their journey. In deference to the Jews of that area, he arranged for Timothy to be circumcised before they left, for everyone knew that his father was a Greek. Then they went from town to town, instructing the believers to follow the decisions made by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in their faith and grew larger every day. I've read that probably a dozen times, never really connected with what was going on. I'm going to pray, and then I'll see if you guys picked up what was going on there, and then we'll try to understand exactly what's happening. It's a hilarious way, in some ways, to end our series. We're kind of leaving with a little bit of controversy, but I kind of was working through Acts 16, and I decided that it would be much better to leave Paul here than to leave him in jail in the church in Philippi. So we're going to leave him here, getting ready to go on the next mission. Father God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your goodness and your grace to us. And Jesus, I thank you for your word. I thank you that even when we find things that are confusing or don't make sense, that your word is life, your word is truth. And you give us clarity as we come to you in humility. And so Jesus, in humility, we come to you. We come to you for wisdom, we come to you for understanding, and we come to you for application. We are not living in this same context that Paul and Timothy were. This story is going to sound kind of funny to us. We generally don't talk about these kinds of things. We don't have this same controversy. But I pray that you would open our eyes to see and our ears to hear what you would have for us as we look to apply your word to our situations. And so, God, we just want to commit these things to you, and we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Originally, as I said, when I was planning this sermon, my thought was that I would go all the way to verse 15. There's 3 different stories in those first 15 verses, and I was going to kind of talk about each one for a couple minutes. But then I started to work on these first 5 verses, and again, I'd read them tons, but I'd never really realized what was happening. And when I did think I understand what was happening, I was like, oh man, something really funny is going on here. And so I thought that it was probably worth us taking our time to dive into this passage. And so before we get into the strange part, I'll talk about the things that were exciting. And as I read this passage, one of the first things that I noticed and one of the first things that excited me was that this is talking about Paul's return to Lystra and Derbe, and then his return to Iconium. Do you remember what happened? I've already referenced it. When Paul went through these regions, people tried to kill him. They tried to stone him to death. There was lots of persecution. And to be perfectly honest, I had wondered in my heart, were these new churches going to make it? I mean, when Paul and Barnabas kind of appointed leaders and then left, I thought to myself, would these new churches be able to survive with the pressure of a group that is actively opposing them? And what excited me as I read this is that when Paul traveled back through this region, he encountered churches that were making disciples. In these regions where they had been and where there probably still was active persecution and threat, the church had survived and grown. Many commentators and Bible scholars think that Timothy was a teenager when Paul passed through the region the first time. He was just a young man, probably 13, 14 years old. He came with his mother and with his grandmother. Timothy placed his faith in Jesus. The church helped him to grow and mature. And now by the time Paul returns, Timothy is likely a young adult. And there's enough relationship between the believers in the churches in this region that they all know of him and they speak highly of him. I realized that I didn't know how big these churches were. I didn't know how often these churches got together, but I found there to be something very beautiful about how these churches have held to the teaching of Jesus. They've been building one another up, and they've been mixing and mingling to a degree that the church in this region knew Timothy, and they recognized God's call on his life. And so there's something very exciting to me about the fact that the churches that Paul had planted have remained faithful to Jesus. There's evidence of spiritual growth. And now as Paul returns, he re-meets Timothy, this boy who has grown into a young man. And then Paul invites Timothy to join him on mission. As I read this and as I realized what happened, one of the things that kind of made me laugh a little bit is one of our Augustana students is a man named Nathaniel Tabert. His dad was my internship mentor. And so I first knew Nathaniel in 2005 when he was like 5 years old. I hung out with his family. We went skiing together. And then I moved away. And then his family moved away to a new community. We kind of lost touch with one another. But then he rejoined us. And so all of a sudden I had a similar experience to Paul. Not with the rest of what we're going to be talking about, but mostly with that experience of here's a guy that I once knew. And now I've re-met him as a young adult, and just it's cool to see faith. Paul has this moment where he ministered to Timothy. He was part of Timothy's spiritual journey. And then as he comes back, he sees that Timothy has grown into this young man of faith. Paul recognizes Timothy's gifts. He recognizes his ability, God's call in his life, and he says, hey, I want you to join my team. I want you to join me on mission. And so far, this makes sense. This is what we want to see happen in the church. We want to see people discipled and grow to the point where they are invited to step into new leadership roles. But then the story takes a strange turn. See, Timothy's a believer. He's well thought of by the church in the region. Paul wants to take him on mission. But then it says that Timothy's dad was a Greek. His mom was Jewish. And so in deference to the Jews of the region, Paul had Timothy circumcised, and then they went throughout the region sharing the good news of Jesus, and it specifically says that they shared the decision of the Jewish council regarding non-Jewish believers, that they did not need to be circumcised or follow the law of Moses to be saved. Did you catch that when I read that? Isn't that weird? Doesn't that kind of seem like hypocrisy? Doesn't it seem a bit hypocritical, right? I mean, you don't have to be circumcised to be saved, but we're going to circumcise this Timothy guy. right? The story doesn't make a lot of sense. And what I find hilarious is it says Paul had, but I have to think as a young man, Timothy also had volition. I mean, this wasn't something that happened to him by accident. It was his choice as well. He was part of the conversation. He decided that it was the right idea. But when I first looked at this story, I thought to myself, man, it seems like there's either stunning hypocrisy on the part of Paul or something else is happening that I don't understand. And so I dove into the story to try to understand what is going on. Is this a religious salvation issue, or is something else happening? And as I dug into the story, commentators suggested that Timothy was caught in a cultural limbo. To the non-Jewish people in his community, he was Jewish because his mom was Jewish. And so those that were anti-Semitic in his community would reject him, even though they would have accepted his dad. But to the Jewish people in the community, Timothy was a Gentile, despite his mom's culture, despite probably practicing many parts of that culture. Because he wasn't circumcised, he wasn't Jewish. And so Timothy was not welcome in the synagogue, he wasn't welcome in the marketplace, but he was welcome in the church. In the church, he found a place to belong. Paul accepted Timothy, Jesus accepted Timothy just as he was, even caught in this cultural limbo. The text says that Timothy was thought of highly in the church community. And so even though in the marketplace he had some question marks, even though he wasn't even allowed in the Jewish synagogue, in the church he found a place to belong. So then we have to ask the question, okay, if the church accepted Timothy, why does Paul want Timothy to be circumcised? Again, I don't think this was a salvation issue. Timothy was saved by believing in Jesus Christ. And I think the fact that he was accepted and well-liked in the church and that they affirmed him in his ministry meant that his cultural status didn't matter to the church. And so as I read the commentaries, many were looking at Timothy's cultural status and Paul's missionary practice, and they suggested this wasn't about religion. Paul wasn't trying to get Timothy to do anything to earn favor with God. They suggested that this was actually a cultural or missional practice because Timothy was Jewish, at least 50%. And by submitting to circumcision, he became part of the Jewish community fully. And Paul's ministry practice in every region that he visited was first to go into the synagogues and preach Jesus to the Jewish people in the community before moving to the rest of the town. And so I think what's happening here is that for cultural expediency, for missional expediency, for the sake of the community that Paul and Timothy wanted to reach, Timothy underwent a medical procedure and became recognized as a Jewish man. And so then, as they traveled together, Timothy, Paul, Silas, they could wander into every synagogue they went through along the way. Now, as I read about this seemed to make sense. I mean, I kind of got the idea. Okay, this is more about mission. This is more about culture. This isn't about religion. This is about something else. But one of the commentaries that I read talked about how people often want to find the inconsistency in Paul in order to discredit him. This is kind of a modern biblical scholarship approach. It's not a new thing. Even in Paul's own day, people tried to oppose and throw shade at him. And in modern biblical scholarship, as I said, there are many who like to look at Paul's writings and his actions, and they try to pick him apart. But one of the things that the commentary that I was reading, one of the things it referenced was how a lot of things labeled as it's inconsistent actually fit within the larger framework of Paul's consistency, his relentless drive to reach people for Jesus. And so I think what's happening here is that Paul finds a young man who is skilled, gifted, he's equipped to be a co-laborer in the gospel, but there is a cultural stumbling block. Timothy is living in this cultural no man's land, and so while he has respect in the church, in the broader community, he has no status, he has no standing. And so Paul and Timothy decide to deal with the block by having Timothy step into his identity as a Jewish man. And this then allows Paul and Timothy to minister to both Jewish people and non-Jewish people with relative ease. So I think that's what's happening in the story. We're not seeing religious hypocrisy. We're seeing cultural adaptation for the sake of the gospel. And as Paul talks about his own missions approach, in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul gives us something of his missions philosophy. He tells us how he lived and acted in different communities that he entered into. In 1 Corinthians 9, beginning in verse 19, Paul says this: "Even though I'm a free man with no master, I've become a slave to all people to bring many to Christ. When I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. When I was with those who follow the Jewish law, I too lived under that law, even though I'm not subject to the law. I did this so I could bring to Christ those who are under the law. When I'm with the Gentiles who do not follow the Jewish law, I too live apart from that law, so I can bring them to Christ. But I do not ignore the law of God, I obey the law of Christ. When I am with those who are weak, I share their weakness, for I want to bring the weak to Christ. Yes, I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some. I do everything to spread the good news and share in its blessings. Don't you realize that in a race everyone runs, but only one person gets the prize? So run to win. All athletes are disciplined in their training. They do it to win a prize that will fade away, but we do it for an eternal prize. So I run with purpose in every step. I'm not just shadow boxing. I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself might be disqualified. I think that's what we're seeing in this passage. I think that is what Paul is inviting Timothy into. I think Paul said, in essence, to Timothy, Timothy, if you undergo this procedure, you will be able to move more easily into one of the communities we're trying to reach. This is not about salvation. You are saved, as we all are, by faith in Jesus. This is about identification. This is about you embracing your mother's culture in order to win people from that culture to Jesus. I think that's what's happening in the story. And then Luke tells us that this missions team went from town to town, instructing the believers to follow the decisions of the leaders in Jerusalem, and the churches were strengthened in faith and grew larger every day. Now, it is worth noting that these churches that they were visiting, this was an area where this question of does a non-Jewish person have to become Jewish to be saved, this was one of the hot-button issues in this region. In Paul's letter to the churches in Galatia, which is the region just north of Timothy's hometown, Paul will write some of his most explicit instructions about this matter, and he'll write that he wishes the oppressors, those that he calls Judaizers, he uses some really colorful language to describe what he wishes would happen to those who put up artificial barriers to people in the path of salvation. So this is one of those things, and the broader group may even have used this Timothy situation as ammunition to say, hey, Paul is a hypocrite. But I don't think that's what's happening. But as the church embraced the truth, what we want to see in 16:5, as the church embraced the truth that all have sinned and fallen short of God's glorious standard, as they embraced the truth that the pathway back to God is not works or efforts, but faith in Jesus, as the church understood that Jesus died for all people and that all people come to the Father through Jesus, the church was strengthened and the church grew. And so this is a strange story, and some of us are thinking, oh man, what did that guy even just say? Right? It's strange. We really don't talk about circumcision a lot. We were praying this morning up here, and I talked about that out loud, about how I get to use that word more often than most. Some of you may have to Google it just to figure out exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not going to get explicit right now. Google can do that for me. But we just kind of started laughing because we realized, oh man, that's what we're talking about today. And so the question is, okay, God, how do we apply this? What might this passage be saying to us? How might God want to use this somewhat strange story to speak to our hearts? How do we move past Acts 16, 1-5 to today and say, okay, God, what do you want from me? And I think as I was kind of reflecting on this, as I was sort of asking God what he wanted to speak to me about this, I think that this story is calling for us to examine our own hearts and ideas and attitudes when it comes to reaching out and sharing the good news of Jesus with those around us. I think God might be calling us to look and see if we're putting up barriers between ourselves and those that God loves that are preventing us from reaching out to them with the good news of Jesus. There's a lot of walls and obstacles that we will put in people's way that prevent them from coming to Jesus. Just like the Judaizers in the story, there's a lot of things that we say, Jesus will love you if. And we won't always say it explicitly. It will sometimes be implicit. In the past, it's been about clothing. It's been about dress. Every so often, you'll see on Facebook the story of a pastor who disguised himself as a homeless man and went into his own church and was kicked out of his own church because he didn't fit. And so the lesson in those stories is implicitly this church is saying, hey, you need a shower, you need a haircut, you need to not smell like booze before you can be acceptable to Jesus. The pastor then gets up, reveals himself, and chastises his church and say, hey, we've put up an artificial barrier. Your dress, your smell, your state of inebriation is not a barrier for you to come and hear Jesus. He wants to do things in your life. He wants to save you. He wants to take some things from you in order to make you more and more like him. But you don't have to clean yourself up to be loved. And I think that this passage is asking us to say, hey, am I putting up barriers? Am I putting up walls? If I had a minor in Bible college, it was probably a missions minor. I've also taken some missions classes as part of a master's program in intercultural mission. And as I've spent some time studying the history of missions and the methodology of missions, one of the things that I've seen of value in the history of missions is this idea of identification, of removing walls, of moving into the neighborhood. There's this guy in the 60s, I believe it is. His name was Bruce Olson. He had a heart for tribal people in South America. He couldn't get a missions organization to sponsor him because he was only 19 years old. And so he literally just hiked into the jungle to try to find these people that he had such a heart for. And he lived beside them. He learned from them. All by himself, he basically tried to learn the language. He tried to learn the culture. And as he began to understand their language, he began to share Jesus with them using their stories. When we talk about putting our faith and trust in Jesus, he recognized that there wasn't the same kind of word, but these people, the people in South America, they slept in hammocks that they tied 30 or 40 feet up in the air. And so they had this word that they used for tying into the right kind of branches. Because when you're 40 feet up in the air and you're going to sleep at night, you just don't put your faith and trust in any branch. And so he talked to them about tying their lives into Jesus, because Jesus is the strong branch that you can trust. And they got it. They tied into Jesus. I love the story of Don and Carol Richardson. They had a heart for the Sawe people in New Guinea. They left home. They moved into their neighborhood. They tried to learn their culture. They tried to learn their stories. The first time they shared the gospel with this people group, they got to the story of Judas betraying Jesus, and the crowd cheered. Yes! Yes! The hero of the story! And Don and Carol said, whoa, we have missed something. But for the Sawe people, that was the highest value. If you could trick a friend to the point where you could betray him by stabbing in the back, that was the highest cultural value. And so they came back and said, oh man, how do we preach to these people that love Judas? And as they continued to learn the story, as they continued to understand the way these different tribes warred together, they discovered that when a war would get too hot, when too much bloodshed and violence and animosity would happen, one tribe would humble themselves, and they would offer their son to the other tribe, not as a sacrifice, but as a peace child. That other tribe would take that peace child, and as long as that child lived, there would be peace between the two tribes. And it was the gravest injustice when a peace child had been offered for that tribe to do anything harmful to that peace child. And so all of a sudden, Don and Carol realized, hey, Jesus is our peace child. But we acted disrespectfully to him. We spit on him, we scorned him, we rejected him, and then we executed them. And suddenly this people's heart broke for the fact that they had spit on and trampled the peace child of God. But then Don and Carol will be to say, but even with this disrespect, God still loved. This peace child came back to life, and he offers a pathway back to God, and the tribe said, we want in. We accept the peace child. We want Jesus. Hudson Taylor, a missionary to China, he spent the first year and a half in China living in a missions compound, dressing like a European and trying to preach to people in English. He realized it wasn't working. And so after 18 months, he moved out of the missionary compound. He moved into the neighborhood. He cut and he dyed his hair so that he would fit in with the local populace. He dressed like a traveling scholar. He learned to speak, read, and write in the local languages. He translated the good news into Chinese, and that became the cultural norm for China Inland Mission. You don't come, you don't look like a Westerner, you move into the neighborhood. In each of these examples, in moving into the neighborhood, in choosing to step into the culture, Paul's line in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 21 is so important. See, Paul stepped into culture, but Paul didn't ignore the law of God. He fulfilled and obeyed the law of Christ. The law of Christ was his utmost. And in each of these examples, these men and women didn't enter into the sinful aspects of their host culture, but they entered into the culture all while obeying and holding to the higher law of Christ. For the sake of Christ, they laid down their rights and their privileges, and they lived alongside those that they were trying to reach. To reach into the jungle, they moved into the jungle. To reach into the streets, they moved into the streets. They moved into the neighborhood. I think that's what Paul asked Timothy to do. I think Paul said, hey, we're traveling on mission, but you got to know in every community we go, the very first place we go is we go to Jewish people. Timothy, you are Jewish, but your dad didn't like that part of your culture. Commentators think the dad was dead now. So Timothy, will you step into that so that we can go, so that we can move into the neighborhood in these Jewish communities everywhere we go before we then move on to the rest of the people? I think that's what was happening. So the question for us then is, how might God be calling us to move into neighborhoods? One of the pastors in my mentoring group was sharing with me on Thursday that he and his family were moving. He lived 6 kilometers from the church that he pastors, but as the demographic in the area changed around his church, he and his family were feeling called to move into their church neighborhood intentionally to reach out. And so he's moving from 6 kilometers away from his church to 8 doors down from his church in order to move into the neighborhood and reach that neighborhood for Jesus. His rent is much higher, but for him, the opportunity to live alongside those that he's trying to share the good news of Jesus with is priceless. It's worth the cost of moving. It's worth the cost of a higher rent for him and his family to move into the neighborhood. And I think that this passage is calling us to think about the people that we rub shoulders with and the people we want to share Jesus with. I think this passage is calling us to evaluate our time and our talent and our treasures and to consider how we might move into the neighborhood alongside our coworkers and family members and friends. And this takes wisdom because we're not to enter into the sinful parts of culture. In every context, we're to commit to obedience to the law of Christ. But in those contexts, we need to ask, what does it look like to value people and let people know that they're valuable to God? Jesus is our example in this. Jesus never sinned, but Jesus moved into the neighborhood. And Jesus was invited to parties. He interacted with people from many different contexts, in many different contexts, but he consistently showed them the love of God. He continually spoke the truth of God. And so I think this passage invites us to consider how we can move into the neighborhood. And I'm using that expression, but we move in all kinds of neighborhoods. I mean, what might it look like to move into the neighborhood at work? What would it look like to be salt and light and hope and truth in the lunchroom, on the job site, or with our boss, with our employees? What does it look like to move into the neighborhood at work? What does it look like to move into the neighborhood with our extended families, to be salt and light and hope and truth at family reunions and events this summer? What does it look like to move into the neighborhood and literally be neighbors to those who live beside us? How might God be calling us to pay the price to tell others how much he loves them? At first glance, this is a weird story. But the more that I think about it and the more that I read Paul's writings, the more I realize that people matter to Paul. And he was willing to pay a great price. He and his team were willing to pay a great price to reach out and let others know about the love that Jesus had for them. And I think for Timothy in this story, he was saying, you want to know what? It's worth it. It's worth it to get awkward and uncomfortable and step into my culture and my family so that I can reach them with the good news of Jesus. It's worth spending a little bit of extra time in that lunchroom where there's lots of awkward conversations happening so that I can get to know my coworkers better, so I can get to know different people better. And again, that high law of Christ is what we need to hold on to. There are some times and spaces and places where God's going to call us to step out of those conversations, but I think that God is calling us to say, hey, are there barriers that I'm putting in place that are blocking or keeping others from coming to know Jesus? Is there places and spaces where I am not moving into the neighborhood that God is calling me to say, hey, it's time to go knock on that person's door. It's time to reintroduce yourself, maybe for the first time. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you for this passage. And God, it's weird. It's a strange passage. It could be very easy for us just to write this whole thing off as Jewish faith stuff, as Paul's hypocrisy stuff. But the more that I kind of wrestled with it and the more that I dove into it, the more I think this passage is calling us, Jesus, to look to you and to ask you to lead us into neighborhoods, lead us into our own neighborhood, lead us into our neighborhood at work, lead us again into the community in Camrose. Father, there's often walls and obstacles that we put in people's ways. There's walls that we build to keep people out. But God, there is possibly something that you have for each one of us here, a way that you want us to step beyond ourselves, to demonstrate, to share your love with those around us. And I thank you, Father, even looking at the people in this room, I see some people that are really good at loving their neighbors. They know their names. They know their stories. They've offered to pray for them. They pray for them. And God, I thank you for those that are really good neighbors in this room. God, I pray that you would call the rest of us to increase our understanding of the neighborhoods that you've put us into, both our physical neighborhoods, but also some of those places where we interact with others, at work, with family reunions, at hobbies, in different places in the community. Would you help us to see and to step out and share your love with others? And Jesus, there's a lot of misunderstanding about who you are. Even as Jerry comes to lead us in a moment and talks, and we're going to sing a song called Who You Are to Me, that song really wrestles with the fact that we are interacting with a lot of people that have no idea. They've heard your name. They think that you are bound to a building. They think that you're all about the rules, perhaps, but they don't understand the love that you have. And I pray that as we sing this next song, that you will remind us of what you've done for us, that you'll remind us again of your love. And then I pray, Jesus, that you would help us to step out and share with those around us who you are to us, that we would be able to introduce them to the love that you have for us. We thank you for this, and I pray that you just continue to speak to us with the call that you have for us in this story. And I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.